YLTSIG. I'd like to warmly welcome you all to the 2019 YLTSIG Annual Web Conference. I'm thrilled to introduce our closing plenary speaker for day one, current IATEFL President, Harry Kuchah. Harry has been involved in English language education since 1996 and has worked with different teacher communities in Africa, Europe, South America and Asia. His professional and research interests include teaching English to young learners, English medium instruction, and the teaching of English in challenging circumstances. Take it away, Harry.
Thank you very much, David. That's very kind of you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you might be in the world. It's actually 21:52, so 8 minutes to 10 p.m. here in my office at the University of Leeds, and I've followed every presentation today and learned a lot from the different sessions since we started in the afternoon. Today I want to talk about one of the things I have been interested in my research with young learners over the last couple of years, because more generally my research has focused on teaching and learning English in what has been conceptualized as difficult or challenging circumstances, but also I've been looking at the role that English language plays in education. Especially for young learners, and what the challenges might be for children from socioeconomically underprivileged contexts studying in English medium schools in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll begin by looking at the rhetoric, the education rhetoric so far from the things that we are told by international organizations such as the United Nations, UNESCO and the African Union, amongst others, have promoted the notion that education is an entitlement. And amongst other things, they have taken positions which are based on the recognition of the benefits of linguistic diversity and multilingualism in education, with a strong consensus on the importance of instruction through the medium of a local language which is familiar to the children, especially in primary school. In fact, underpinning policies like the Education for All movement, and also notions of social justice, discourses of social justice and equity. And quality is often, when you read through UNESCO documents, quality education, quality basic education is often embedded in mother tongue or a familiar language of instruction, rather than in a foreign language. But unfortunately, more than 60 years for some countries after independence in Africa, Africa is still the country where children go to school, the continent where children go to school in a language that is not familiar to them, in a language that's not spoken in the community, that's not spoken at home. And this has huge consequences on the quality of children's engagement with the curriculum and on the nature of the support that parents or the community could give children. So the language of school kind of shuts the door of schooling from the community, and so they can't help children. Not long ago, in 2013, Howard Coleman conducted a study in Francophone West Africa, because that would be my focus for the first part of my session. And he did arrive at some very interesting conclusions, because he examined the language situation in these countries and found at that time that primary education was not yet the thing. English language in primary schools was not yet the thing, but English was definitely a subject in all the secondary schools in these countries. And except for maybe Guinea, which started a bit later, all these countries start teaching English from the first year of secondary school. But he also explored other things, including the domains within which English language was used in these countries. So the domains included things like places like commercial and industrial firms, regional and economic cooperative organizations and commercial banks, for example, international development agencies like the UN, UNESCO, UN peacekeeping missions, and also English was used for trading with Anglophone countries like Nigeria or Ghana, and in the case of Guinea-Conakry, for example, with countries like Liberia. And to an extent, students were learning English because they would use that for to further their studies abroad in English-speaking countries. Now, when you look at these different domains of language use, you realize that they don't really concern children. They don't involve children. Children are not involved in international development agencies, in peacekeeping missions, in commerce across countries. But yet, these countries are considering introducing English in primary schools for all sorts of reasons, some of which we would explore in a couple of minutes. So, what could be the driving forces for this? John Simpson of the British Council identifies a couple of possible forces that are influencing policymakers to adopt a reform that's including English in primary schools, in state schools, in these countries in Francophone West Africa. Now, the whole idea that the economies are loosening up, they want to get access to the international market and therefore need English to break through those markets and invite businesses into their country. But also the national pride that government wants to show that their school leavers are able to gain access into higher education institutions in English-speaking countries like the UK and the US. And there's also the recognition that English language teaching isn't working in secondary school. And so the quick fix is to say, all right, let's introduce it in primary schools. But the onset thing in the literature is the fact that sometimes this is promoted by parents themselves who see the private sector, so very elite private schools are offering English, and the parents are seeing these children from very rich homes in private schools, and they want the state to also give their children access to English without taking into consideration the specific realities of their own children, of children from very poor backgrounds. And the overall belief sometimes that I've seen from teacher associations who also want to establish good relationships with the ministries of education to justify their presence, and they are promoting that. And more recently, there are also publishers who are promoting primary English in some of these countries, donating books and free teacher training with the purpose of finding their way into that market. So all of these things tend to build around the myth that the earlier children learn a foreign language, or the earlier children learn English in this case, the better, or the more they would learn, they would master the language. But of course, is early really better? We know from research that primary age children learn languages slowly. So they are slower in the way they learn foreign languages than secondary age children. The research on that is very clear. We also know that there is really no difference in English proficiency when children start learning very early to when they start learning much later in secondary school. So the investment in teaching English to primary school children comes to nothing in terms of output when they get to secondary school. And we know that from the literature that a later start is even better than an earlier start in relation to speed. So the evidence is clear, and sometimes there's also research from Africa, which I'll refer to in a moment. So we know that all these things we know, but the myth of earlier is better keeps persisting in Africa and I guess elsewhere in the world. Now let us look at the literature again and see what the conditions for success in early English language learning as a foreign language would be. One of the most important conditions for learning that researchers have found for learning a foreign language is literacy in the first language. Of course, there are other conditions such as teacher proficiency. Who are the teachers? Do we have teachers who are proficient in the language? Very often in these countries, no. The intensity of instructions, how much exposure do the children have to English language? How do we sustain their motivation all through the period within which they're in school learning the English language? How do we ensure that the curriculum, the transition from primary to secondary is smooth, that children are not singing songs and playing games in primary and suddenly asked to do a test when they get to secondary school? What are the classroom and school conditions that might promote effective second or foreign language learning? These are some of the conditions that need to be put in place for English language as a foreign language in primary schools to be effective. But let's just look at the two that I've highlighted in blue and see what the statistics from Africa tell us, from Francophone West Africa. So, if you look at the UNESCO statistics for initial government funding per primary school pupil in dollars, you'd find that these 9 countries from Francophone West Africa fund that education, primary education. The total expenditure that these countries put to a child in primary school is $822. That is 9.21% of what Canada invests in the education of one child. It is 12.8% of what France invests in one child. And it is 7.64% of what the UK would invest on one child. So in other words, let's take the case of Canada. I'm using Canada because it's a bilingual country like Cameroon. So what Canada invests in the education of one child would sponsor up to 1,000 children from these 9 countries. So in terms of government investment in education, it is extremely low, and no doubt, therefore, primary school classroom and schooling conditions are absolutely poor, especially in rural parts of these countries. And like we said before, this is an essential condition for learning any subject of the curriculum, but also very importantly for learning a foreign language. Now let us look at literacy levels in these countries. Now these statistics come from the PASEC. PASEC is Programme d'analyse des systèmes éducatifs de la Confémène. So it's the Francophonie countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a kind of education network that monitors and evaluates education outcomes. Now, the countries you find here and the numbers that you have on your screen tell us something. So in Benin, for example, 90.4% of the children who get into primary school do not have the minimum level of French literacy required for them to survive education in the medium of French. So only about 8% or so attain the minimum literacy level. And that's in French, not even in L1. Now I'm using these statistics because in the absence of L1 instruction in this country, French becomes the default L1 of schooling. And if we consider that 90% or 62%, for example, in Congo, of the children who get into primary school do not even have the minimum literacy rates in French to survive education in the medium of French, then we should be asking questions. Why add English to this, to the curriculum of these children? Now, after 6 years of primary school, when they graduate from primary school and are ready to go to secondary school, in Benin, for example, 54% of graduates, primary school graduates, still do not have the minimum literacy levels in French to survive secondary education in the medium of French. And in Senegal is quite interesting because you would see that it's only 38%, and that's a topic for another day. But we know, for those of you who are used to West Africa, that that Wolof has quite a strong influence, and literacy in Wolof might account for the speed at which children learn to read in the foreign language, which is French, and that's not the same case in the other countries here. So just looking at these two in terms of school and classroom conditions and literacy in L1, or by default the L1 of schooling French in this country, one wonders why why policymakers continue to want to introduce English in primary schools. Now, I would leave Francophone West Africa as a big block and zoom in on Cameroon. Cameroon presents a very interesting case for all sorts of reasons, one of which is the fact that I am from Cameroon, but more importantly, the fact that it's got a colonial heritage which links it to both Britain and France. Now, the rhetoric in Cameroon has been consistent on education, basic education, has been consistent with international rhetoric that I cited at the beginning of this presentation. So free and compulsory education in primary school, because Cameroon endorsed the education for all policy in the early 90s. And the law on education in Cameroon recognizes two subsystems of education, one which is the English medium subsystem, and one which is the French medium subsystem. And these two descend directly from the colonial relationships that the country had with France and with the UK that I just referred to. And these each have their unique system of assessment. And although there might be overlaps across the curriculum, they are significantly different in many ways. So for example, children in French medium primary schools would study something called Éducation civique et morale, civics and moral education. In the English medium school, it is called human rights, which includes, it is called citizenship education, which includes human rights, moral education, and civics. Now, but the education law in Cameroon has recently focused a lot on bilingualism, promoting bilingualism as a factor of national unity and integration. And if you know Cameroon, for those of you who are following the news from that part of the world, Cameroon is in a serious crisis now, and that's not unconnected with some part of the country being English and part of the country being French. So far from being uniting languages, these languages have actually played a big role in dividing the country. And so the state wants to maintain unity and keeps promoting these languages across the two school, subsystems. So children go to an English medium school or to a French medium school from the first day of nursery and primary. But in addition to that, they also have to study the second official language. So if a child went to a French medium school, they would have to study English as a subject. And if a child goes to an English medium school, they have to study French as a subject. And that has been a policy since the early 2000s. We also do, now to enforce this, the curriculum was reformed. The French medium subsection curriculum was reformed in 1999, and the English medium school syllabus, the new curriculum, was developed in the year 2000. Now let's take the French medium schools, for example. English and French, so French in a French medium school, French language would take up 8.5 hours of a 30-hour week, and English would take up 4.5 hours of a 30-hour week. So English and French are taught for 41.67% of the week. And the other subjects in the curriculum, 13 subjects, will be taught for the rest of the 58.33% of the time. Now, if you add maths to that, then the other subjects take up a very limited time. So children spend a lot of time in school learning English and French rather than learning the sciences, for example, or other subjects in the curriculum. In fact, science and environmental studies in the primary curriculum consist of only 2 hours a week. And we all know that English and French do not build planes, science does. So in language, the 2 languages are promoted at the expense of the knowledge that children need to be able to be productive in society. And there's also this booming private sector, bilingual schools, elite private bilingual schools that are pushing parents to demand a bit more from teachers in state schools. And as a result, because teachers, and a colleague of mine at Kuchah in 2003 established that parents were dissatisfied with state provision of English. Francophone parents were dissatisfied with the quality of English language that their children were being taught in these state primary schools. And as a result, they were beginning at that time to send their children to English medium schools. And what happens, therefore, in Cameroon today is that more and more children from Francophone homes are being sent to English medium schools. Now, let's very briefly look at the national syllabus that defines a curriculum for English medium schools in Cameroon. 2 clear provisions in that syllabus, in that curriculum, say that at the level of basic education, the mastery of English by the pupil would enable them to grasp with ease the other subjects of the curriculum. They don't need anything else to access the other subjects of the curriculum. English language is the key. Now, in terms of the practicalities, in terms of the recommended pedagogies, one of the key requirements for teachers is to create avenues for maximum exposure of pupils to English language. And this entails that English has to be taught in English. Now, because the syllabus promotes an English-only practice, this is then translated into the other subjects of the curriculum. So teachers understand this as meaning that they have to teach English only in English, and by default teach every subject of the curriculum only in English. Of course, there's no other view on this, because even when you talk to policymakers and to head teachers, that's the view that they all hold. So these Francophone children then are trapped in English medium schools, where the only key to learning is in the medium of English, and sometimes learning in conditions that are not conducive for learning as a whole and for foreign language learning. In fact, in the major cities, up to 89 of Yaoundé and Douala in particular, up to 89% of the children that you find in classrooms in state English medium schools come from French-speaking homes, from Francophone homes where French and other local languages are spoken. So my colleague Lizzie Milligan at the University of Bath and other colleagues from the University of Yaoundé, Dr. Obanako and Dr. Njika, over the last couple of years have been looking at what children actually do in a classroom, what Francophone multilingual children studying in English medium schools actually do to survive the curriculum, to navigate the curriculum that is delivered to them in a language that's not the language of home. And the literature from Cameroon and elsewhere in Africa tells us a number of things. It is very clear from the literature, for example, that there are sociopolitical and economic motivations for countries and individuals trying to adapt English as a language of instruction, at least in terms of their perceptions. We know that the resource challenges, there are lots of resource challenges in these countries that makes it difficult for children, for quality education to be provided to children, especially those from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. We know that there are issues of teacher quality and of pedagogic practices. We know, for example, that teacher-centered practices still dominate classrooms in this part of the world. We know, for example, also from the literature, that there are many different possibilities for teaching multilingual children apart from the English-only policy that applies in Cameroon. But what do we not know? We do not know, for example, how multilingual children learn and what helps them to learn outside the classroom. We know how they are taught, but we really do not know how they learn. So recently, thanks to this British Council ULTRA funding, my colleagues and I, we've been working with children in Cameroon, trying to understand how they navigate the curriculum through the medium of English. And our hope was to be able to find patterns which can inform policy and pedagogic practice for multilingual children in English medium schools. Early today, Ana Maria Pinta was looking at the different institutional policy documents that have motivated research with children over the last couple of years, and she referred to a number of sources that I would not come back to, but that informed our interests in focusing on children. But one of the things that we hold as a team of researchers was our belief that as major education stakeholders, children have a right to contribute to discussions about what constitutes meaningful education to them, and to share their perspectives, and for these perspectives to be considered. And if I might use the words of Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, they have a right for their views to be given weight. And we wanted to look at what they were doing, to talk to them, to examine their experiences of learning in the medium of English, and to make their voices heard, in the hope that this would inform policy. I hope it will. So how did we do this? In all, we worked in 4 classrooms from 2 different schools in the capital city of Cameroon. And we had, from these schools, we identified a number of children from French-speaking homes through different processes that I would not waste your time explaining here. And then we collected data through 12 semi-structured classroom observations in these 4 classrooms. And we also had 8 English and maths unsupervised tasks. I will comment on that in a moment. And we had 4 group interviews with children, 5 children from each of the classes. And we also know 6 children from each of the classes. And we also had 4 individual interviews with children we identified from the focus group interviews for specific reasons. Now, to make the children involved in the whole research process, we asked the teachers to design a task in maths and another task in English. And we identified 5 children who help us look at our data collection tools. So one of the tools they looked at, one of the things they looked at was the task. And these children advised us on the task in terms of what they thought was appropriate for their course mates, for their mates. And one of the things they did was that, well, they agreed with the maths task. They thought the maths task was fine, but they changed the English language task. So the original task that the teachers agreed on was to ask the children to imagine that there was another child from another part of the country who was coming, whose parents had been transferred to Yaoundé. And so they were thinking about studying in one of the schools in Yaoundé. And these children were, the teachers wanted the children to write a letter to that child, advising them to come to their school and giving them all the advantages of coming to their school. But the children told us, this looks like a question in the common entrance composition. It is not very interesting. Why don't you just ask them to write a story? That would be easy because everybody would want to write something. Some people are not good at letter writing, but everybody can tell a story. So we agreed with the children, and together we worked out what the story would be, and it was simply starting the story for them. Once upon a time, there was. So in a sense, the children themselves gave us an input. In fact, we went ahead to administer the two options to different groups of children as a second phase of our piloting. And what we gathered was that the children were more responsive to the story. In fact, they were more responsive to the story than the composition topic that the teachers had developed for them. So that was quite useful for us to engage the children as much as possible. The next thing we wanted to agree on with the children, although we knew we wanted to do that, but we thought we would check this with the children. Would the task be written in the presence of one of us, the research team? We agreed that we didn't need their teachers around because the power of relationship with their teachers was different from ours. We had spent time socializing with the children. So we wanted to find out from them whether they thought it would be easier to do the task in the presence of one of us or on their own. And the advice was, no, please give them the task and go away. However, for each of the 4 groups, we checked before taking the final decision. So we asked them, do you want us to be here while we do the task? We gave them the maths task and the English task, and for each group, we negotiated how much time they needed to complete both tasks. And we asked them if they wanted one of us to be there or to leave them on their own. And they were consistently in agreement that we leave them on their own. So that's why the task ended up being an unsupervised task. So what we did was we placed a recorder to record all their interaction while they were performing the 2 tasks, and to compare that interaction to the final output that the children had prepared, because that would give us an idea of the resources, the linguistic resources, and the strategies that they were using to negotiate content as they develop, to engage with the task that we gave them. So, what did we find out from our study? We found out, for example, that these children were quite, in terms of the resources that they had, in terms of the material and human resources that the children had, they were quite above the average in Cameroon. So, for example, UNESCO Institute of Statistics data for 2016 show that in Cameroon, in state schools in Cameroon, there are up to 13 children per textbook in state schools, per reading textbook in schools. So 13 children use 1 textbook for reading, and 12 would use 1 textbook in mathematics. But these children were quite different socioeconomically because they had lots of resources. We found that these children had lots of resources, so they were not the poorest of the poor. They were quite well resourced. For example, almost all of them had textbooks for English, and nearly half of them had a computer at home, and in fact 5 of them had an iPad, 2 had a home teacher, and 5 had a reading room in their own. So you would see that these children, compared to the average children in those state schools, were actually well resourced. However, in terms of their linguistic resources, in this group of 22 children, there were 9 languages spoken in addition to French. So they came from 9 home language backgrounds, including Bafia, Bamum, Bulu, Douala, Eton, Ewondo, Fulfulde, Hausa, and Maka. So this was a huge, for us, huge linguistic resource that the children brought to the classroom. But we also noticed that these children, the things they told us, revealed that they spoke French entirely on their way to school and back. And we observed that French was the language of the playground. During break, when they played with each other, it was not English, it was French. And they used French in different social settings. French and their mother tongues were used, and Arabic were used in religious settings. So for the Muslim children, for example, they were exposed to Arabic in the mosque. And some of the children from the center, the Ewondos, for example, went to churches where the local language was spoken. And English was not a resource for these children beyond the classroom. So outside the classroom, English was not their language. Their only exposure to English was in the classroom. And when we asked the children to write their languages of preference, if they had to pick their first language or second, we actually asked them to put their top 3 languages according to the order of preference. 14 of them identified French as their language of preference. 6 said their mother tongue was their language of preference, and only 2 of them put English top. Now, in discussions with one of the 2, in an interview with one of the 2 who identified English as their first language of preference, we found that the proficiency level of that child was very weak. So we wanted to interview the child in English, and they wouldn't respond. So when we asked, do you want English or French? And they said French. And the reason they gave was because I understand French more than English. So why did this child pick English as their language of preference? This can be explained in many different ways, but in the interview we found that this was actually the discourse of the parents being translated by the child rather than their own, what they themselves perceived of themselves. So for example, at home, they were the only one attending an English medium school, and their siblings attended a French medium school. And as a result, this child was called an Anglophone. So their parents referred to them as Anglophones and referred to their siblings as Francophones. And to keep up with that new identity that's been imposed on them because of the medium of instruction in the school they attend, these children came to see themselves as Anglophones rather than as Francophones. And that meant that they would identify with English even though they had difficulties with the language itself. That was it about their resources, but let's look at their learning strategies. So we observed that in class, for example, that when a child did not understand what the teacher was explaining, there were 2 ways in which they navigated meaning. They tried to make sense of what the teacher, who was predominantly speaking in English, was saying. There was a split between those children who used the teacher as their main resource, so they would ask the teacher questions directly. But there were some who would not ask the teacher questions, who would ask questions to their friends. So we had people asking questions like in the class, while the teacher was explaining, in one of the classes, while the teacher was explaining something in maths, we had children say things like, LCM, c'est quoi? What is LCM? And the other would say lowest common multiple, and then go ahead to explain what that means or translate that into French. And we felt that those children who came across as stronger students or more competent or more maybe confident in their proficiency asked questions directly to their teacher because they could speak in English. And those who asked questions to their friends while the lesson was going on were predominantly doing that in the medium of French, and we presume that might be because they were not very confident or their proficiency in English was very low. Now, I didn't mention that these were 11 to 12-year-old children in the final year of primary. So some of them they had actually been learning in English and in the medium of English for 6 years. For those of them who started straight in primary, some of them a bit more because they had gone to nursery schools. So let's look at some examples of how the children interacted with the decision to interact, the decision as to who they interacted with in the classroom when they had difficulties accessing content was. So in an interview, for example, we asked this child, if you have a problem or something you do not understand in class, who do you prefer to ask? And the student says, my friends. Why? Well, sometimes I ask the teacher, but if I cannot say it well in English, I ask my friends. Of course, because the teachers insist that they must speak to them in English, because this is an English medium school. So if they cannot say it in English, they prefer to ask their friends. And sometimes the teacher turns around and catches them and says, oh, you're making noise. And sometimes they will be punished. So the child goes away without understanding anything because they don't have the opportunity to ask the teacher. The other child we talked to, we asked the same questions and we looked at their subjects and asked them which of these subjects would you prefer. Now this one on the other side of the screen identified spelling. Oh, I really love spelling because it makes us to understand well. And then we asked them, makes you understand well? Yes, the words. If you have a word in English that you don't understand, what will you do to understand it? I will tell the madam to explain to me. Now you see that this child could sustain a conversation in English, and that's probably why they are confident they can tell their madam to explain to them. But the other child would ask the friend because they are not confident. So these were the kinds of things that made us arrive at the conclusion that the interpretation I just got a few moments ago. A second example, can you remember anything? So we were talking about how they interact with their friends and how they unravel meaning of concepts that they don't understand in English. And this child we asked this child, can you remember any time when you asked something from your peers or your friends? And he said, yes, I asked another student. What did you ask her? I asked her how we do fraction, decimal, if she had understood when this was done in class. And then we asked, in which language did she explain this to you? In Bulu, this is a child who comes from a Bulu background. And she says no in French. And then we turn to the rest of the class. Everybody in French? Yes, because it's easier. For me, it is because I don't yet understand English well. And student 6 says, I don't understand English well myself. So you can see that these children are using another language. They are in an English medium school, but they're using a completely different language to navigate the curriculum. And they're learning from each other, even if they are not engaging so much with the curriculum. At least they are learning basic concepts by using a language other than the language that is imposed on them in the classroom. Now, our classroom observations also showed us that children often concentrated a lot. So translation was one of the most widely used of their strategies. They concentrated a lot on just getting what language the teacher was using, rather than really engaging in the content of the curriculum. So basic questions, what is the meaning of this word? What does this word mean? Can you explain this to me? In classroom, they were asking them for translations. At home, when we interviewed them, they said at home, they were using all the resources that were available to them, but predominantly using these resources to translate the curriculum. So for example, some used family members, some used their home teachers, some used their other siblings, the home teachers of their siblings, but they mostly used them to help them translate content into French. Others used bilingual dictionaries. In fact, we had a case of a child who said they used Google Translate to translate their homework into French, complete the homework in French, and then translate it back into English, which is a hell of a long process for an 11-year-old struggling to achieve quality education that can make them compete with other children around the world. And this kind of approach to learning has huge implications for their cognitive engagement with the curriculum itself. and also in terms of fairness across all children who would not have these resources to enable them. So children who do not, for example, have a home teacher, children who do not have a bilingual dictionary, for example, would be disadvantaged. Now, this doesn't even put those who have these resources at an advantage, because translation itself takes up a whole lot of time for adults. What more for children? We also found from our observations that there was really no sustained group work in any of the 11 lessons that we observed. Maybe I would have explained further the lessons we observed. So we decided that we were going to observe English language for each of the 4 classes. We were going to observe some English language lessons and some maths lessons. And then we asked the class teacher to choose a 3rd subject of their choice. So we observed different subjects in the 4 different classes, in addition to English and maths. And very often, I think, we thought giving them that opportunity to choose the 3rd lesson would mean that they'll choose a lesson that they feel confident and capable of teaching. So in all those lessons we observed, there was very limited pair work, very limited engaged group work amongst children. And teachers most often used safe talk and were writing notes on the board for children to copy into their exercise books. Now, safe talk is simply providing all the information and requiring students to just complete the information with one word. A typical example that we heard in the classroom would be something like, the teacher says, a person who roofs a house is called, and the children complete the sentence with a carpenter. So in all of that utterance, it is the teacher who was making the sentence, and the children were simply completing the sentence or showing their understanding by using one word. So access to the language itself, or engagement with the language itself, use of the language itself, was very minimal for the children in these classrooms. So because of this, the children were getting very limited opportunity to write. They were basically copying from the board, or just helping complete sentences. They were not speaking. They didn't have ample opportunity to practice the language in the classroom, both in English language lessons, but also in the other subject areas. Now, I want to share with you the 2 excerpts from the unsupervised task, because these 2 examples show us the range of language resources that these children were drawing on to be able to develop meaning in the classroom. Now, the task in mathematics required them, I'll read out the task for you here. I think I should have it somewhere. Right. I can't find it, but they wanted the children, they gave them, they said, for example, a rope, it was called a worded problem in maths. And a rope is 7,560 meters long. How many ropes of 15 meters can be cut out of this long rope? And so the children were required to solve this problem in a group on their own. And this is some of this text comes from the recorded interaction. Now, because it was very difficult to identify each of the children speaking, I'm presenting this as continuous text, but this actually comes from multiple children interacting at the same time. So it goes like, okay, let's start from mathematics, because we gave them the 2 tasks at the same time. Let's start from mathematics. You use long division. Long division? Yes, nah, that's pidgin. You don't know long division. What? Ce n'est pas le long division. C'est quoi alors? And don't shout at me. A rope is 7,560 meters long. How many? Okay, attends. Long division, c'est division. It's a long division. So it takes them time, and they're using French to identify what mathematical formula they're going to use, what mathematical process they are going to use to approach, to solve the maths problem. And you can see that they're predominantly speaking in French. They're also using English, key terminology in mathematics. But also there were expressions that came from some of the local languages, Pidgin, for example, and some of their local languages. The other example comes from the story task. And we started with once upon a time, there was an old woman who lived in a forest, and the children were required to continue the story. And this is what some of the interaction we had. She was called Mrs. Mary, and then the laugh, someone laughs. She was called, you can write Lillian. No, she was called, write Lillian. Toi-même, écris ici. Ce que tu as mis là. She was called Mary. Simple as that. Alors, c'est vrai, Mary. Dis ce que je vais écrire. Tell me what I would write. So again, this interaction, as you would see, was predominantly in French. And they were using local expressions, exclamations, for example. He was living in a, or for example, voilà, on a crissa. He was living, and they say, she was living on trees. Pourquoi vous criez? She was living on trees in the forest, etc., etc. So this kind of recording, these recordings, we match these recordings with the final text to see, and in both tasks, the final texts were quite substantial. I've not included that in my slides, but it was interesting to see the difference between, and the similarities between the interactions that they had and the final product, which was in really good English, I would say, with very few mistakes. So this gave us an idea about how children use language in learning a context. And these were some of the things we found from tasks like this one. So sometimes the children stayed completely within their familiar language, which in this case was French. So they were using French entirely most of the time to help explain concepts in English language. We also found that they were using borrowing. They were borrowing directly, for example, words or expressions from the original language and using them in the target language, which in this case was English. So, for example, c'est pas le long division. Tu connais le answer. J'aime le flac. Snake est toujours dangereux. So that's the way they use language when they're trying to navigate the curriculum in the medium of English. They were code switching. For example, après on dit que c'est, we have finished. There was a lot of linguistic interference in their communication with each other, but also there were translations or loan translations that were embedded into the way they express themselves in English. For example, they learn me how to read and write. Ils m'apprennent comment apprendre. So they're using a structure in French and transferring it directly into English. Now, these are different ways in which the children were trying to navigate the curriculum, drawing from the language that they were familiar with outside the school environment. Now, what do we learn from this? What we learned from this was that, and from the literature we read, was that there are possible multilingual strategies where learners can actually use their multilingualism as a resource to support engagement in the curriculum and in English language itself. And of course, as we saw earlier, language, the local language, L1, can in fact, or other familiar languages can in fact support the development of English language and vice versa. And there are all sorts of strategies in the literature and in what the children were doing. For example, the they were using code switching. We didn't quite find translanguaging, but the literature tells us that translanguaging is a fantastic way of engaging multilingual children in developing, in accessing and processing curriculum. We've heard about language supportive materials and pedagogies, for example, work that's done by my colleague Lizzie Milligan and other colleagues in Rwanda, for example, with materials. So these resources are available, and we can embed them into teacher education to support these children. But we also learned that learners are reliant on strategies that just help them to get by, to just understand rather than engage in the curriculum. At least that's a strategy they are using to access the curriculum. We could potentially develop those strategies to a point where they're actually helping them go beyond just getting by the content. Teachers' approaches, for example, which allow the content to be covered. We talked about teacher talk, safe talk, for example. So the teaching approaches themselves, we found, did not help the children really engage with the curriculum. They were just helping the children to know, as we would say. And the fact that these practices were they were very monolingual in nature, for us, caused an epistemic injustice, even for children from socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds, as these children were, because they have a different language that they can use, but the teachers were not using these languages. So there's a degree of injustice in the way curriculum and pedagogy is set up in this context. And we thought, drawing from the experiences of the children, that we need to engage in action that goes beyond the rhetoric. And I think researchers are quite central in this. What is the message that we are telling policymakers? What is the message that we are telling international donors, for example, who are supporting quality education in these countries? And how is that being translated by policymakers to teachers themselves? So I think that researchers need to be engaging more with these donor bodies which provide funding for basic education, because they hold the stakes. They can effectively say, we will give you money on condition that you're doing what is right for the children. But beyond that, we need to also help in demystifying the myth of English and development for children, because the domains of English use in international development do not really involve children, and there is no point in hurrying to expose children to a language that is not the language that will help them access the curriculum and engage with the curriculum and develop cognitively. We need to be recognizing that the multicultural nature of EMI classrooms. Now, when you look at the curriculum in Cameroon, for example, it's all about English and French. There's no way, even in the national policy, it says the government shall institute or promote, the government shall promote the teaching of English and French, and the government shall endeavor to promote local languages. And there is no promotion of local languages at the level, or primary level, for example. So we thought we need a more explicit recognition of the multicultural and multilingual nature of English medium classrooms in the policy, because once the policy recognizes that, then we have a framework for beginning to think about teacher education for multilingual classrooms and multilingual pedagogies for classrooms. So we need to be thinking about designing a multilingual friendly curriculum and a syllabus, which we don't have in Cameroon at the moment, and also embedding that into teacher education. But more importantly for me, I think it is important that English is promoted as the icing on the cake, not as the cake. Because as long as the discourse of English and international development continues to permeate these cultures, this context, people and policymakers and parents are always going to believe that without English, their children don't have a future. But like we said before, English does not build planes. English does not make a car. English does not drive a car. English is the icing on the cake. And our children need the cake first, which is the content, which is engagement with the curriculum, which is cognitive development, before language, which would help them to then share their knowledge and learn more from other people who speak the same language. I think I have come to the end of my session. These are some of the references that are cited, and I would want to say thank you very much for listening. If there are any questions, I'll take them. Right. Can teachers be involved in policy making in your country? That's a very interesting question. I don't think, well, teachers are often invited, representatives from teachers are often invited when important decisions are being taken, but unfortunately, it's not often the case that what teachers bring with them is taken on board. It's often because there is a funding body that, for example, the competency-based approach, Cameroon actually at the time had two different funding bodies, the Projet Éducation 2 that was funded from Belgium and Plan International funding. And these two groups came to the ministry and they had key persons from the ministry working with them. And these key persons were inspectors, for example. So and there were slight but significant differences in the approaches to the competency-based approach by these two organizations, which was very confusing. So what then happens is that when teachers are invited to training or to discussions with inspectors about the competency-based approach, inspectors who work with Projet Éducation 2 have a slightly different approach to the competency-based approach. And then these teachers go to class and they are observed maybe by someone who's been working with Plan Cameroon and who says, no, that's not right, it's supposed to be this. So there's a lot of confusion, and the reason why I talked about funding bodies is because a lot of the international funding bodies, a lot of the policy in this country are driven by funding from international organizations. And sometimes you wonder whether these funding bodies have listened to researchers from within the context before implementing or funding the projects that they fund. So I don't think that teachers are heard. Well, teachers' voices are heard. Whether they are acted upon is something completely different. Right. I don't know if I could pick any other question. David, if David, you're there, can you help me find any of the questions?
I think Wendy's saying, is there any interest in understanding the learners' voices of what works for them in order to learn?
Right, okay. Now, one of the things we did in this particular research is that the two colleagues that we worked with in Cameroon, one of them is actually the boss of pedagogy in basic education at the moment, the Inspector General of Education in the Ministry of Basic Education. So it was for a strategic reason that we included her in our team. And she's got access to this data. And we went back and shared this information, this research with policymakers in the country. And it's actually in on day 2 of the workshop. We shared this with teachers. We also invited parents. We invited children who had come through English medium schools and were in a secondary school to share their experiences. And of course, a few other colleagues from the university and the University College of Education. That was on the first day. On day 2, we worked just with these policymakers, and it is in that meeting that we were told that this curriculum, which I showed you, this national syllabus, which I showed you, was designed at a time when people did not quite, the push for English medium education by Francophone parents was not as it is now. So the fact that these policymakers were able to listen to us and to interact with us and to agree with us in many respects, they did agree, and they did say, well, this is true because that curriculum was all about French and English, and we had not realized that there are many more children from French homes getting into English medium schools now. Cameroon is actually, at the moment, revising the curriculum, we are told, and we can only hope that the findings of this study would inform what they are doing. But of course, researchers are researchers and not policymakers. We can provide the empirical evidence. What happens next is not often defined by the research that we provide. It's often more political. And unfortunately, language policies are mostly political policies rather than linguistic policies. Otherwise, there's evidence in Cameroon in the 90s and in 2009 of children. For example, the most recent research in Cameroon shows that children who go to school in the medium of BCom, which is one of the local languages, perform far better at the end of primary school than their counterparts who went to school in the medium of English. They perform better than them across the curriculum, including in English language. So it is not the lack of research in the context. It is a policy issue, but also the mega trends and the discourses of English in international development that are being pushed by the major funding bodies on which
Okay, well, thank you very much for that excellent closing plenary, Harry. It was absolutely fascinating, and I think, as someone mentioned in the chat box, that you covered a very complex and multifaceted area in a very interesting and in a manner and in a way that we can learn in other contexts a lot from. Things like the children's voices and doing research with children, and children having a stake in choosing how the research will be done and what the research tools are, I think is really fascinating and very empowering. And also the idea of teacher education needing to respond and to children's multilingual repertoires and help teachers to draw on these repertoires as a resource for the curriculum. So thank you so much for that. And I really love this metaphor of the cake and the icing in particular. And I think so many contexts around the world would do well to see the learning and the teaching of English in that way. So thank you so much for your plenary today. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody, so that brings us to the end of our first day in our 3-day whirlwind tour, our 3-day web conference. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our 3 plenary speakers today. So we opened with Chris, then we had Anna Maria, and we've just closed now with Harry. Also to our 5 speakers who gave talks today, starting with Rachel, John, then Maha and Omar and Joe, and of course our Troika panel discussing primary and secondary teacher education in the Brazilian context. So we have much more for you tomorrow, another packed 8-hour day with 3 plenaries and 5 talks and panels and showcases. So please join us tomorrow at 2 GMT. Please convert to your local time. And we are delighted to be opening tomorrow at 2 GMT with Carol Reed's plenary focused on early years learners. So wherever you are in the world, thank you so much for attending. Sinem has put the link for your digital certificate there. Please download that and add your details. It includes all of today's sessions on that certificate. So with that, I'd like to declare the first day of our 3-day conference closed, and we're very much looking forward to seeing you again tomorrow